November 15th, 1945, 2:30 in the afternoon, a cramped interrogation room on the third floor of the Dai-ichi building, Tokyo. Outside the window, autumn light filters through the skeletal remains of what once was the world's most confident empire. Admiral Soemu Toyota, the last wartime commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, sits rigidly across from three American intelligence officers. His white uniform, somehow still immaculate despite 4 months of captivity, contrasts sharply with the tired faces of his interrogators. The translator, a Japanese-American lieutenant, shifts uncomfortably as he prepares to convey words that no Japanese officer could speak during the war. Toyota's weathered hands, which once commanded the mightiest fleet in the Pacific, now rest motionless on the scarred wooden table. He takes a slow breath and then speaks the mathematical truth that 4 years of warfare had hidden behind honor codes and spiritual rhetoric. "We never had more than a 10% chance of victory," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your industrial capacity was overwhelming from the beginning. We knew this, but we could not say it." The silence that follows seems to stretch across the Pacific, carrying with it the weight of 68 million casualties, burning cities, and sunken fleets. The American colonel leans forward, his pencil suspended above his notepad. This is not the defiant rhetoric they expected from Japan's naval commander. This is something far more devastating. The admission that America's greatest enemy knew they were doomed before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The translator hesitates, perhaps understanding better than anyone the cultural earthquake these words represent. In admitting they knew defeat was mathematically certain, Toyota is confessing that 4 years of war, millions of deaths, and countless acts of heroism were executed by men who understood they were fighting the impossible. But why? The question hangs in the tobacco-stained air like incense in a destroyed temple. Why would a nation commit to a war they knew they could not win? Why would admirals who understood American industrial supremacy order their pilots to fly missions that were statistically hopeless? The answer lies not in the courage of Japanese warriors, which was never in question, but in a fatal miscalculation that confused spiritual strength with material reality. It lies in intelligence reports that were accurate but unthinkable, in production statistics that were precise but culturally inadmissible. The story of Japan's war against America was not a tale of brave underdogs fighting impossible odds. It was the story of leaders who knew those odds exactly, calculated them with mathematical precision, and chose to ignore the mathematics in favor of miracles that never came. Admiral Toyota's confession in that November interrogation room was not the revelation of a defeated man seeking mercy. It was the final honesty of a professional warrior who had been forced to send his men to die in a war he knew was unwinnable from the very first day. The numbers had always been there, stark and undeniable as a depth charge explosion. To understand how Japan chose to fight a war they knew they could not win, we must travel back to the intelligence briefings of 1940 and 41, when Japanese naval planners possessed remarkably accurate assessments of American industrial capacity. These were not the propaganda fantasies that would later fuel public enthusiasm for war, but cold statistical analyses prepared by Japanese officers trained in Western military academies. The reports were devastating in their precision. America could produce 324,750 military aircraft during a 4-year war period, while Japan's maximum sustainable production was 76,320 aircraft. American shipyards could launch more tonnage in a single month than Japanese yards could complete in an entire year. The oil production disparity was even more crushing. America pumped 151 times more petroleum than Japan could access from all its conquered territories combined. But these numbers, accurate though they were, crashed against cultural and ideological barriers that made their implications unthinkable. Japanese naval doctrine was built upon the foundation of superior training, tactics, and individual warrior excellence. For 3 centuries, Japan had successfully compensated for material disadvantages through superior discipline, planning, and fighting spirit. The victories against China and Russia had proven that Asian warriors could defeat larger, better equipped enemies through tactical brilliance and unshakable resolve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, privately understood the industrial mathematics, but publicly maintained that Japan's advantages in pilot training, aircraft design, and tactical innovation could offset American numerical superiority in a short, decisive campaign. The plan was elegantly simple. Strike hard, win quick, negotiate from strength. What Japanese planners refused to contemplate was the possibility that America might choose to fight a long, grinding war of industrial attrition rather than accept a negotiated peace after suffering initial defeats. This refusal to consider long-term industrial warfare was not mere oversight, but cultural impossibility. Japanese military philosophy viewed extended material campaigns as fundamentally dishonorable, a confession of spiritual weakness. Real warriors won through superior skill and dedication, not through overwhelming their enemies with manufactured goods. The concept that Americans might prefer building 10,000 adequate aircraft to building 1,000 perfect aircraft was alien to Japanese thinking. When intelligence reports showed that American pilot training programs were expanding to produce nearly 200,000 aviators, Japanese planners dismissed these figures as propaganda or waste. Why would any nation train so many pilots unless they expected to lose most of them? The Japanese answer was cultural projection. Americans must be poor warriors if they needed such vast reserves. This fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial philosophy would prove catastrophic. The first cracks in Japanese confidence appeared not in the smoke over Pearl Harbor, but in the speed of American response to that attack. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the strike force that achieved tactical perfection on December 7th, watched through his binoculars as American damage control teams swarmed over burning battleships like mechanical ants. Within hours, not days, American welders were sealing hull breaches, pumping out flooded compartments, and preparing salvage operations with an efficiency that surprised even Japanese observers who had planned for American industrial capability. The missing critical targets, fuel storage facilities, repair shops, and submarine bases were operational within 48 hours, supporting rescue and recovery operations on a scale Japanese planners had not anticipated. This was their first glimpse of American industrial philosophy in action, not elegant perfection, but overwhelming, systematic efficiency applied to every problem from damaged battleships to wounded sailors. More troubling was the American replacement rate for damaged vessels. Japanese intelligence had calculated that major ship repairs would require months, possibly years, based on their own experience with similar damage. Instead, they watched American yards perform miracles of industrial speed that defied Japanese understanding of proper shipbuilding. The aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, critically damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, limped into Pearl Harbor with a hole in her flight deck large enough to drive a truck through. Japanese estimates suggested she would be out of action for at least 3 months, possibly 6 if damage was as severe as it appeared. Instead, American shipyard workers completed repairs in 72 hours, sending Yorktown back to sea in time to participate in the Battle of Midway just weeks later. This was not skilled craftsmanship, but industrial impossibility made routine, a preview of production capabilities that Japanese culture could recognize but not comprehend. Even more alarming were intelligence updates about American pilot training programs that Japanese commanders initially dismissed as propaganda or mathematical errors. Reports from Japanese agents in the United States described training facilities designed to produce nearly 20,000 pilots annually. Numbers so large they seem fictitious to officers from a nation struggling to train 3,000 pilots per year. American flight schools were operating around the clock, using training aircraft in numbers that exceeded Japan's entire frontline fighter force. The implications were mathematically obvious, but culturally unthinkable. America was preparing to treat pilots as mass-produced replacements rather than irreplaceable warriors. Japanese training philosophy emphasized years of perfectionist instruction to create superior individual pilots who could compensate for numerical disadvantages through tactical excellence. American training philosophy emphasized rapid production of competent pilots who could achieve victory through overwhelming numerical superiority and unlimited replacement capacity. By 1943, the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory was becoming undeniable on every Pacific battlefield. But the most devastating evidence was not in combat casualties, but in replacement statistics that revealed the true scale of American industrial supremacy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when Japanese tactical excellence collided with American production abundance. In 2 days of air combat, Japan lost 476 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers, while shooting down only 29 American planes and sinking no major American vessels. The loss ratio was devastating enough, but the strategic implications were apocalyptic. Japan had just sacrificed the majority of its remaining experienced pilots against an enemy that could replace both aircraft and aircrew faster than Japan could count its losses. American task force operations revealed logistical capabilities that Japanese commanders found psychologically impossible to process. A single American carrier task force consumed more aviation fuel daily than Japan produced monthly from all its conquered oil fields combined. American pilots flew training missions that burned more gasoline than Japanese combat sorties, and American mechanics discarded aircraft parts that Japanese technicians would have salvaged, rebuilt, and treasured. The USS Essex alone carried more aviation ordnance than the entire Japanese mobile fleet, and when Essex returned to port for resupply, American logistics officers complained about delays if fresh ammunition did not arrive within 48 hours. Japanese aircraft carriers, by contrast, rationed every bomb, counted every bullet, and stretched fuel supplies until pilots were flying missions with barely enough gasoline to return to their ships. This was not superior American planning, but superior American abundance, the practical demonstration of industrial capacity that Japanese intelligence had accurately measured, but Japanese culture had refused to acknowledge. The pilot training disparity became a death spiral that no amount of warrior spirit could overcome. By 1944, American pilots were receiving 600 hours of flight training before their first combat mission, while Japanese pilots were being rushed into battle with 40 to 70 hours of instruction. American training programs were so abundant that pilots practiced aerial gunnery until they had fired thousands of rounds at moving targets. Japanese pilots often flew their first combat missions without ever having fired their aircraft's guns. The mathematical result was predictable and tragic. Inexperienced Japanese pilots flying fuel-starved aircraft against superbly trained Americans in unlimited numbers flying aircraft that could absorb incredible damage and continue fighting. Japanese squadron commanders watched their pilots die, not from lack of courage, but from lack of preparation, victims of an industrial war that their nation's production capacity could never support. The oil shortage became so critical that Japanese pilots could not practice basic flight maneuvers, let alone advanced combat techniques. By late 1944, Japan was producing synthetic fuel from pine tree roots, while American bombers were flying missions solely to practice formation flying. The moment of final realization came for Admiral Toyota during the planning sessions for Operation Tengo in April 1945, when Japan committed its last major surface unit, the battleship Yamato, to a suicide mission that epitomized the complete bankruptcy of Japanese naval strategy. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was loaded with fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa, where she would beach herself and fight as a stationary gun platform until destroyed by American forces. The mission was militarily meaningless, but symbolically essential. Japan's mightiest warship would demonstrate that spiritual dedication could compensate for material hopelessness. As Toyota reviewed the operational plans, He experienced what he would later describe as the most devastating moment of his military career. The mathematical truth he had suppressed for 4 years crystallized with perfect clarity. Japan was sending its greatest naval asset on a suicide mission because they lacked the fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots necessary for normal naval operations. The contrast with American operations was so stark it seemed to mock Japanese efforts. While Yamato sailed towards certain destruction with barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa, American Task Force 58 was conducting round-the-clock operations with 14 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and hundreds of support vessels, all abundantly supplied with fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft. American pilots flew multiple missions daily, while Japanese pilots hoarded every gallon of gasoline for their final flights. American naval aviation was so abundant that entire squadrons were held in reserve for training purposes, while Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The industrial mathematics were inescapable. America could lose 50 ships and replace them within months, while Japan could not afford to lose even one major vessel without irreplaceable strategic consequences. The destruction of Yamato on April 7th represented the final collapse of Japanese naval power, but more importantly, it represented the final admission that industrial capacity was more decisive than warrior spirit in modern warfare. American aircraft from multiple carriers swarmed over the Japanese task force like mechanical locusts, dropping bombs and torpedoes in such quantities that Yamato's anti-aircraft guns were overwhelmed within minutes. The great battleship, symbol of Japanese naval pride and engineering excellence, sank under an avalanche of American ordnance delivered by pilots who treated the mission as routine training rather than climactic battle. Japanese survivors reported that American aircraft continued attacking long after the outcome was certain. Not from cruelty, but from abundance, dropping bombs simply because they had more ordnance than targets. This was American industrial philosophy in its purest form. Overwhelming application of manufactured superiority until resistance became impossible. Admiral Toyota watched intelligence reports of Yamato's destruction with the detached fascination of a man observing his own cultural suicide. The battleship had absorbed more punishment than any warship in history, demonstrating Japanese engineering excellence and crew dedication until the final moment. The final phase of the Pacific War revealed the complete transformation of naval combat from a contest of tactical skill to a demonstration of industrial capacity, as American forces achieved levels of material supremacy that made Japanese resistance statistically impossible. By mid-1945, the United States Navy was operating with such overwhelming abundance that individual battles became industrial exhibitions rather than military contests. American carrier task forces included more aircraft than Japan possessed in its entire remaining air force, consumed more fuel daily than Japan refined monthly, and carried more ordnance than Japan could manufacture in 6 months. Japanese commanders found themselves fighting not against enemy strategy or tactics, but against American production statistics made manifest in steel and high explosives. The kamikaze attacks, portrayed to the Japanese people as the ultimate expression of warrior spirit, were actually the final admission that conventional naval warfare had become impossible when fighting an industrial giant with unlimited replacement capacity. Japanese pilots, reduced to 40 hours of flight training and flying aircraft cobbled together from salvaged parts, were ordered to crash into American ships because Japan could no longer afford the fuel, ammunition, or trained personnel necessary for normal combat operations. The tragic irony was mathematical. Every successful kamikaze attack required the sacrifice of an irreplaceable Japanese pilot and aircraft to damage an American ship that could be repaired or replaced within weeks. American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than kamikaze pilots could destroy them, while Japanese training programs were graduating fewer pilots monthly than America lost in routine training accidents. The USS Laffey, a destroyer that survived 22 kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes on April 16, 1945, became a symbol of American industrial resilience versus Japanese desperation. Despite catastrophic damage, Laffey remained afloat and fighting because American damage control techniques, based on mass-produced equipment and standardized procedures, could overcome even the most determined suicide attacks. Japanese observers who witnessed the battle reported that American ships seemed to absorb impossible amounts of damage while continuing to fight effectively. Not through superior armor or design, but through superior damage control systems that treated battle damage as a production problem to be solved through systematic application of manufactured solutions. This was American industrial philosophy applied to naval combat. Even destruction could be overcome through proper application of mass-produced repair techniques. The final statistics revealed the complete mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory and explained why Admiral Toyota would later testify that Japan never had more than a 10% chance of success. America produced 324,750 military aircraft versus Japan's 76,320. American shipyards launched 141 aircraft carriers, compared to Japan's 17. The post-war interrogations revealed the full extent of Japanese leadership's understanding of their impossible situation and provided devastating testimony about the cultural factors that prevented acknowledgement of mathematical defeat. Admiral after admiral confessed to American intelligence officers that they had known from the beginning that Japan could not win an extended industrial war against the United States. These were not the bitter admissions of defeated men seeking to excuse their failures, but the honest testimonies of professional military officers finally free to speak the truth about statistics they had understood but could never publicly acknowledge. The interrogation transcripts, classified for decades, revealed that Japan's war against America was fought by leaders who knew they were mathematically doomed, but culturally unable to admit that industrial capacity was more important than warrior spirit. The transformation of Japanese attitudes toward American industrial methods became the most significant long-term consequence of the Pacific War, as defeated officers became advocates for the production techniques that had destroyed their military forces. Admiral Toyota, in his final testimony, admitted that Japan's post-war reconstruction would require adoption of American industrial philosophy: mass production over perfectionist craftsmanship, efficiency over elegance, and abundance over scarcity. The same officers who had dismissed American industrial capacity as spiritually inferior now recognized that survival required mastering the techniques they had previously scorned. This intellectual revolution was more decisive than any military victory, transforming former enemies into students of American production methods and creating the foundation for Japan's post-war economic miracle. The lessons learned from Japan's fatal miscalculation extended far beyond the Pacific War and established principles that would govern military planning for generations. Modern warfare had been revealed as fundamentally industrial, decided not by tactical brilliance or warrior courage, but by production capacity, resource allocation, and logistical efficiency. Nations with superior manufacturing capabilities could afford to make tactical mistakes, replace losses, and learn from defeats, while nations with limited industrial capacity could not survive even tactical victories that consumed irreplaceable resources. The Japanese example proved that in industrial warfare, the factory floor was more decisive than the battlefield, production lines more important than battle lines, and accountants more valuable than admirals. The cultural implications were equally significant, as the Pacific War demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize superior long-term resources compared to military dictatorships that emphasized spirit over statistics. American abundance was not accidental but systemic, the product of political and economic systems that encouraged industrial efficiency, technological innovation, and resource optimization. Japanese scarcity was similarly systemic, the result of cultural values that prioritized perfectionist craftsmanship over mass production, individual excellence over systematic efficiency, and spiritual dedication over material abundance. The war proved that in modern conflicts, cultural attitudes toward production and consumption were more important than traditional military virtues, and nations that could manufacture victory were more likely to achieve it than nations that could only fight magnificently. The final testimony of Admiral Toyota in November 1945 provided the most devastating summary of Japan's fatal miscalculation and explained why the Pacific War was decided before the first shot was fired. "We fought with samurai swords against assembly lines," he told his American interrogators, "and wondered why we lost. Your industrial capacity taught us that in modern war, the factory is mightier than the sword. Our honor demanded we fight. Your production ensured we would lose. Now we build cars instead of battleships, and we are no longer enemies, but partners in prosperity." This admission represented more than military defeat. It represented the complete intellectual transformation of a warrior culture that had finally understood the mathematical realities of industrial warfare. The numbers that Japanese leaders had known but could never publicly acknowledge became the foundation for understanding how industrial democracies could defeat military dictatorships through production rather than heroism. America produced more military aircraft in 4 years than Japan could manufacture in 20. American shipyards launched more tonnage monthly than Japanese yards completed annually. American pilot training programs graduated more aviators in 6 months than Japan trained during the entire war. Most significantly, American industrial capacity was expandable, capable of doubling or tripling production as needed, while Japanese capacity was fixed, limited by resource constraints and cultural resistance to mass production techniques. The war proved that abundance defeats scarcity, that industrial efficiency overcomes tactical brilliance. The transformation of former enemies into industrial partners demonstrated the ultimate victory of American production philosophy over Japanese warrior culture. The same officers who had led kamikaze attacks against American ships became advocates for American manufacturing techniques in Japan's post-war reconstruction. The same industrial methods that had produced Liberty ships, B-29 bombers, and Essex-class carriers were adapted to produce automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods that made Japan one of America's closest allies and trading partners. This was the final irony of Japan's fatal miscalculation. The production techniques they had dismissed as spiritually inferior became the foundation for their post-war prosperity and security. The assembly lines they had scorned as unworthy of true warriors became the source of economic strength that military conquest had never provided. The lesson of Japan's fatal miscalculation echoes across history as a warning about the dangers of cultural blindness to mathematical realities. When accurate intelligence conflicts with cultural impossibilities, when statistical certainties are sacrificed to honor codes, and when warrior spirit is valued above production capacity, the results are predictable and tragic. Japan fought magnificently and lost completely because they measured courage while America measured production, counted honor while America counted aircraft, and treasured individual excellence while America perfected systematic abundance. In the end, 10,000 perfect zeros could not defeat 100,000 adequate Hellcats, and the war was decided in Detroit, not in Tokyo Bay. The ultimate truth was as simple as it was devastating. They brought swords to a gunfight, and then wondered why they lost.